Garcello, a doctoral research assistant at the University of San Diego, and I'll be moderating this webinar with Dr. EILEEN Wibbeke. She is the most noted intercultural leadership guru in the world. She spent 20 years in business leadership and management roles for Fortune 500 firms, including a decade in Silicon Valley, and is an international consultant and professor of leadership and management. Before we begin, please note the following. This webinar will be archived. If you missed something, would like to hear the webinar again, or would like to see the presentation again, they will be published to the ILA website shortly. You will receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. We welcome your questions throughout the webinar, and at any time you may ask questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions during the second portion, the last 15 minutes of the webinar. Please note, however, that we might not be able to address all of the questions that we receive. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. EILEEN Wibbeke. Thank you so much for being with us today, EILEEN. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you so very much, Maureen, and it's a lovely sunny day here in San Diego, which I'm sure many of you will see in a couple of weeks because of the ILA conference being held in San Diego this year. So we want to just reiterate that the conference is happening in a couple of weeks, and hopefully you've all registered. Okay, I'm just going to now the next slide. And so this webinar will be about global business leadership, which is the second edition of a textbook written recently to further explain the concept of geoleadership. Okay, and as we go further, well, thank you very much for the introduction, Maureen. A couple of other things I wanted to touch upon was I started out as an instructor in the UC system at UC Santa Cruz. I also taught for the University of Liverpool and other institutions. I'm a dual citizen of the United States and Ireland. And so far, I've kept a list every time I've taught a class, either in person or online. And right now, I'm proud to say that I have had students logged in from more than 156 countries. And just 2 weeks ago, I had somebody from Chad in the heart of Africa, which was quite amazing. And the other thing just wanted to mention was that I'm currently on the Fulbright Specialist roster and looking forward to working on a project within the next year, have some ideas, and I'm very honored that I was chosen to be on the roster. Okay, as we go forward, I wanted to just take a moment to talk about Warren BENNIS. I'm sure we all know who Warren BENNIS is and was. We were incredibly honored that he contributed the foreword to the second edition of Global Business Leadership. I had the honor of being invited to his memorial service in Los Angeles at USC, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago. And it was just probably one of the most moving experiences I ever had in terms of, you know, when you think of the field of leadership, executive coaching, and that whole arena, you know, sort of the big names, you know, Tom Peters and Marshall Goldsmith, and all these people were there to pay tribute to Warren because he was so well, I want to say loved and honored and just so very well respected and incredibly optimistic despite many things that had happened through his life. And I wanted to just bring this together because I remember one of the times that I last saw him was at the ILA conference in Los Angeles in 2008, and he received the Lifetime Achievement Award. And I just had found out that the day before he was there, he had been in the hospital. But he said, okay, no, I'm getting an award. I'm going to go to the hotel, and, you know, I want to make sure that I keep my promises. And he was just such a great man of integrity. So also, when we asked him to give a quote sort of on our book, we were very honored. And he said that we stretch beyond our borders and into reality where a mastery of business culture and leadership is no longer a nice to have, it's a must have. So those are kind of the 3 building blocks of geo-leadership: business, culture, and leadership. So I just wanted to mention a word there about I would say the man that people would say is, I guess, the father of leadership studies. And then another thing I'd like to just mention, I had the opportunity and the honor several times meeting up in Palo Alto near Stanford with Edgar Schein. And he was very generous when we showed him the manuscript and everything to say, you know, I would be happy to contribute to your book. So especially in our Chapter 9, the principle of capability. And we wanted to thank him and honor him for that, and definitely recognize, you know, the fact that we wouldn't be where we are today without the work and the theoretical research by people such as BENNIS and Edgar Schein. Okay, this kind of information that we're all going to talk about sort of culminated in this book. It's the Global Business Leadership, and the 2nd edition came out recently. It's published by Taylor and Francis, or also Rutledge, out of Oxford. So we're very pleased with that. And I'm not sure if many of you know this, but a good friend of mine was the librarian at Microsoft, and she can find anything. And she introduced me to a website called WorldCat, like catalog.org. So if any of you have written, you know, a book, mostly books, textbooks, or things of that matter, if you go to that website, you can type in the name of your book or put in your last name or the ISBN, and it will tell you in what libraries around the world have your book. And sometimes I go in, and I think now it's, I don't even know. I mean, I know it's South Africa, Indonesia, places I wouldn't even imagine. So that's kind of something, you know, interesting to look into when you have some time. And if you can't find it, you can also send me an email afterwards, and I can let you know more about it. Okay, so kind of now delving into the main content of this webinar, I wanted to just sort of, maybe it's my MBA background and the metrics, but I always start off with a number. And roughly 70% global business ventures fail because of mismanagement of intercultural differences. And, you know, I think the term going out in the industry now is global mindset. And the risk of not, you know, possessing that is enormous. I see all these leadership conferences and leadership summits and things like that, and a lot of them, you know, that's kind of the buzzword now, is global mindset. And, you know, over the years, companies have been building these models, but fewer than 10% of them even mention global work language. So, you know, I remember once in Silicon Valley when I was at Novell, my boss was Eric Schmidt, who went, of course, then to Google. We always said he won the Silicon Lottery. And, you know, emailing him saying, we want our marketing departments in other countries to have more budget so that they can, you know, reach out to their customers more. And he would say, well, why should I give you more money? We're already getting 50% of our revenue from overseas. Why should we give you more benefit to make that 55%? And then you switch over and you look at a company like Google, whose rise was primarily based on the fact that it was, it's not I guess you would say it was crowdsourced in a sense. It was, you know, the developers in the world contributed to it. I mean, where else would you have a translation into Klingon? I mean, it's kind of funny that way, but, you know, it was very open. And if they weren't so open globally, I do not know if they would have the same success or if they would have had it, you know, much later. So what this kind of culminates now into is the Geoleadership Model. And I'm sure you've seen lots of models out there. I just saw another one yesterday. This is the 7 competencies required of a geoleader. And the evolution of this basically has been it started with my doctoral research, and one of my committee members told me that it should be turned into a book, which was the first edition published by Elsevier in 2008. And he said one thing that's very important, always show your data, because if they agree with you or they don't, if you show your data, they can make their own conclusion. And that's something I think has been very good advice going forward. So right now, and then this, the book came out, and then a couple years later, as we know in the publishing industry, there's acquisitions and mergers, and my title was bought. They said we'd like a new revision, and that's what we're talking about today. So here is the model, and it's basically what are the 7 core competencies required of a geo-leader. And one thing I wanted to just kind of say here, it's kind of funny, is I have a friend of mine who is a geologist at UC San Diego at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And she says, geoleadership, you mean, are you talking about rocks? And I said, no, especially in the business world, where you're talking about the regions of the world, particularly in the sales context, you're talking about geos. There is the Americas, there's EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa, there's Asia Pacific. That's how it is meant in this context. So we're looking at the 7 competencies, as you can see here, and each one is very important, and to find someone who can exemplify every one of them is kind of rare. They do exist, and we have a list right now for our new report that we're going to do. Is here are the ones that we feel right now are geo-leaders. They don't necessarily have to be just in business or have to be in politics or have to be in academics, but it does show that leadership and culture are linked, and they're very strongly linked. Because why? Because it's about relationships, resources, and respect. So that is, if you want to say, EILEEN, what exactly is geo-leadership? And I would say it's a relationship between the leader and the led for the management of resources through the vehicle of respect across cultures and geographies. And for most of all, I think a lot of people forget that most leaders in the world were followers at one point. I mean, unless perhaps you're born into a monarchy, for example, you were a follower at some point, and you're the one controlling the resources. And above all else, in the research I've done around the world for the past 20 years has shown me that I think the 2 key, I would say, variables in terms of leadership that are most important are respect and self-awareness. So, and then, people say, well, how are you denoting culture? And that's, how one perceives and deals with the world from, a foundation of linguistic and mental characteristics. So when I talk to my students and we're talking about, ethics and cross-cultural communications, and we even go into racism and ethnocentrism and things like that, I say to them, I ask them 3 questions. I say, where were you born, when were you born, and into which house were you born? And I would say, well, I was born in Los Angeles, California, into a very Irish Catholic house, sometime in the, let's say, mid-1960s, and it was a very strict household. Now, I had no control over any of that. So when people are judging leaders or judging followers on these things, I always think that's rather illogical, because you can't judge somebody. I don't think it's fair to judge someone on something that they had no control over. Now, if somebody decided to go out and steal a car, that's different. They can have control over that decision, which comes back to, I forget, but I think the politician said this, there's no bad man or bad women, they're just bad decisions. So what I go then after that is I say, because they say, well, leadership, where does it start? And I would say, well, who were your first examples of leadership? And pretty much it's your parents and it's your teachers. And they're the ones in the beginning that are guiding you, that are leading you, that are teaching you. And above all else, culture is key. And for example, my parents came to this country. My husband came from another country, with different, language abilities and different educational backgrounds. And I often ask people when I can hear an accent, thinking, where are you from? And for example, I didn't hear my parents' accent at all because I grew up with them. But I would say to them, what I noticed is, when they counted, when they did their checkbook, they counted in Irish. And when they prayed in Irish. And so sometimes when I meet somebody, I say, what language do you pray in and do you count in? It's kind of a very interesting question, and it doesn't have to be, about religion or whatever. And it's very interesting what people say. And then you can kind of go, okay, well, if I was brought up in Turkey for the first 15 years, that will have formed my mindset, because Hofstede, for example, says it's usually by the age of 10 that people will have the ability to choose between, or to actually evaluate between what is right and what is wrong. So the difference between these two books, the first one and the second one, was about 80% new material in the second edition. And what I wanted to do, where in the first edition it was mostly about case studies, the second one was about interviews. And again, my MBA metric mind, I said, there's 25 interviews, and I broke it down from where they were. And what I wanted to do, I don't know, it's maybe too pop culture, but if you look at the TV show, it's called The Actor's Studio. At the very end, they ask a celebrity the same questions. For example, what's your favorite word? Or when you get to heaven, what do you want someone to say to you? Things like that. I took that idea, I drafted about 10 to 12 questions, put together a survey, and then identified people that were examples of thought leaders in business, culture, and leadership, and have them do the survey, and then get the results back, and then put it in a book. And I have to say, it was probably one of the most interesting research projects I had ever done, because when I think what I would say, oh, I think he's going to say this, he's going to ask, this question, or he's going to answer it this way. I was totally wrong so many times. But what it did do is it showed them all, and all of them actually, to a certain extent, understood this, was tying business culture and leadership together. And I do remember that a couple of key things. So one of the ones I remember the most was a CEO of a medical device company here in San Diego, and he goes, you can't even talk about business or culture or leadership until you, sign a check and you get a check. And I thought that was, very interesting. Okay, this is just a list I'll put up for a moment that you can see who were all the interviewees that we were honored to have take part in the second edition. And we tried to match up the 7 C's with the people who were interviewed. So, who would best be under care, who would best be under change or communication. And I'm sure, well, I hope anyway, that you recognize some of these names. And a couple of them have since changed their position, but I still put down who they were when I did talk to them. Because, for example, Osama Bedier from Google left Google and now is at a startup that is going to apparently revolutionize the payment system for, he was in charge of Google Wallet, and now it's going to be kind of getting all your credit cards together into one card. And that's it's a startup right now actually out of, I think, New York called Payoneer, kind of like Pioneer, but Payoneer. Okay. So let me, excuse me, let me continue on. So I'm just putting up some key findings. This, by all means, is not all the findings, but ones that I thought were interesting. So obviously, cultures vary widely, in how they view business, including how to lead and how to follow. And even with this minimal understanding of cultural difference that can be learned through distance study, it's going to be tough and frustrating. You look at a country like, because I had an interviewee, a colleague of mine who's from Mongolia, and that was by far one of the most interesting interviews. And she's saying, all these expats are going to Mongolia because it's like the next gold rush, the copper, all the different resources are there. But Mongolia is in between China and Russia. And the Mongolian people have a very, very strong culture. When you say Mongolia, people might say, Genghis Khan. So you think, well, how am I going to do business there? Most people who go there don't learn the language. I'm talking about people who go there to work. I just found out from someone, they have an Irish football team in Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital, which is really interesting. So it just, nothing is simple when it's so very different. So if you're there to learn it, you're not there to change it. The next one is a combination of globalization, societal changes, demographic changes, like we now have 5 generations in the workplace, and the lack of skilled business leaders that are coming out of business schools now have created a global talent crisis. Excuse me. And more than one of our interviewees mentioned that. So you have that, and then you put that next to a postmodern perspective of leadership as being something that we can emerge anywhere in an organization when it is needed. So it's kind of like, it's situational. But because so many of them mention that, you would think, for example, there would be, there are many business schools. I went to Thunderbird for my MBA, which has recently been, I think acquired by Arizona State, but it's still going to be Thunderbird. And, even back then when I went to school there, it was talking about globalization, and, 80% of the population at the school were from other countries. And here we were in the desert of Glendale, Arizona, learning about this information, which is now, it's still going on. It's just sort of now becoming apparent. And then the third finding, which I sort of touched on before, there's no right or wrong culture. There's just different cultures. And, I think we've all had experiences where we've traveled, and maybe we've seen other Americans being people from the United States, and they say, wow, I'm in this museum in, I don't know, Spain, and wow, how can I be here? I can't enjoy it because everything's in Spanish. And it's kind of like it doesn't really click that, you're in Spain, it's going to be in Spanish. So different types of economies also are existing. And this is really important now, particularly in the last 10 years, when you've seen I want to say the creation and the growth and the explosion of the knowledge and the creativity economies. Because in a company, the intellectual capital, is in people's heads, right? And how do you get that out? It's not something that they can, they need to be challenged. They're on a project, they're in a group, and the culture shapes the image of the ideal of a particular nation or organization. Because that was when I was going to do this webinar, and I also did another similar one last week for a university. I wanted to say, is this about national culture or is it about organizational culture? And it's about both, because both influence each other very much. So I'm just going to go through some of the interviews, and you'll see usually at the bottom something that is underlined. That really is a key point that I want to get across. So the first person we interviewed was John Ryan, CEO of the Center for Creative Leadership, which is here in San Diego. It's also in North Carolina and I think Singapore and some other areas. So one of the questions we asked him, as I said, each interviewee all got the same 10 or 12 questions, but we picked out the question that we thought most would be relatable to the person. that we were interviewing. So for him, and also just to mention, his boss or his mentor was a man named Walter Ulmer, who used to be the commandant of cadets at West Point. And Walter Ulmer wrote the foreword to the first book that we had. So maybe being in San Diego with the, we have a bit of a military sort of slant in part of the book. So the question is, what's the most important decision you make as a leader of an organization that you have been part of? And he says, there's three things you have to look at. You have to set a direction, you have to create alignment, and you have to prioritize talent decisions. And the very bottom is kind of, culminates into the idea, this might sound very trite, but so few leaders are giving talent the focus it deserves. And when you realize that, there are schools now, I believe there's a school in San Diego where you have to study abroad in their business school before you graduate. That is a wonderful, necessary thing. And if they could do that in every business school, I think that would be amazing, because it's not until you actually go and experience it and you're immersed in it. I'm a very big fan of cultural immersion. You're never going to understand this. And I remember being told in, Silicon Valley, because I wanted to go to the different regions, the different geos, and meet the people so that we could establish a relationship. And a lot of this was before, really, it was sort of when the internet was getting more commercialized and being used more by companies. And, we wouldn't have the budget. But when I did have the opportunity to meet them, I remember at one company, I got to meet the people that I worked with in Brazil that I usually had issues with. But after spending, 3 days with them at a conference, I don't want to say we were the best of friends, but the relationship improved tremendously. And it was very interesting last week at Warren Bennis's memorial. Charles Handy, the founder of the London Business School, his son is Scott Handy, and he was Warren Bennis's godson. And one of my favorite, I want to say, quotes comes from Charles Handy, which is, touch means trust. We'll go on a little bit later and see about talking about virtual trust. So the next one, if you're familiar with the area of intercultural communications, is a Dutchman named Van Trompenaars, and he's the founder and director of Trompenaars, and Hampton Turner, his partner is Mr. Hampton Turner. And the question is, basically, what's the one characteristic that you think every global business leader should possess? And I thought this is really interesting, how he said this. First of all, it was competence, That was the first word, was competency, to, recognize, respect, reconcile, everything. But he's talking about the difference between a dilemma and a problem. And to me, I had never thought about that. To me, they were synonymous. And he says, with a dilemma, you need to try to bridge the opposite. So when there is an issue, and you're doing negotiations, for example, is this a problem? Is this a dilemma? When you're doing negotiation, you look at your BATNA, which is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And that's very important. So just trying to understand, okay, is it a problem? Is it a dilemma? And if it is a dilemma, you have to build that bridge. Okay, the next one, as you may know, I like to say, we had sort of the father of leadership studies was Warren Bennis. I would say Gerrit Hofstede, he was a professor, a writer, a researcher, an educator, just an amazing man. He's still, he's in Holland. He's about, I think, 87 now. And he is kind of the father of intercultural communication. And we were so happy that we were able to have him be part of this, because he is known for his 5 dimensions of culture. There's now 7, and I think there's an 8th now, but I'm only going into the five, and his sort of heir apparent is a man from Bulgaria who basically replicated Hofstede's work within the last, I think, 10 years. So there's one of the questions I asked him was, and I have to say, he had the most concise answers of anybody in the survey. Some people wrote pages. He had like a page of answers. And we asked him, what's the biggest challenge facing global business leaders today in corporations? And I was really struck by his answer. It was, the biggest challenge is becoming a victim of greed. And I think we can all see, or have seen examples of that around the world. The other question that I didn't put here, but I just thought was so interesting is, what is the one thing you would ask a business leader when you meet them? And, some people will say, well, who is your mentor, or, where did you go to school, or whatever. And his question was, when I meet a business leader, I ask them, tell me about a day in your life when you were 16 years old. And I just thought, kind of what a bizarre question, but what a really interesting question. And, how would I answer that? How would you answer that? And how would that is affecting how we're doing business, understanding culture, and leading others. And because he basically says it's up to about the age of 10 or 12, usually about puberty, when our mindset is set in the fact of us knowing between right and wrong, and our cultural variables have kind of, also been set, because culture is really the first gift that your parents give you, right? You have no choice over, again, where you were born, when you were born, into what house, what language you spoke growing up. That was all given to you by whoever raised you. And so that's, I always say parents are everyone's, first leaders. Okay, then we were excited because Qualcomm, being here in San Diego, Qualcomm is the largest employer in San Diego, and if you have any type of cell phone or smartphone, 9 times out of 10 it's going to have a chip from Qualcomm. And so Irwin Jacobs founded the company. Actually, it's 2 companies, very successful companies, and now his son is the head of the company. And we basically just said, what effect do you think national culture has on business leadership decision making? And this can include your own native culture. He was born and raised in Massachusetts. And what he basically said was, it's very important that you have to have integrity. If you don't have integrity here, you're probably not going to have it there or here somewhere else. You have to have it here, because as a CEO, you're setting both the organizational tone and culture, and also that's being influenced by the national culture, because, if Qualcomm was in Korea and the CEO was Korean, how different would it be? And so that's, I think, something very, very important to understand. He's also a very big, I would say, proponent of education, particularly in STEM careers, which are science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And so it's important to understand, even when you grow a company, once you cross the border, you need to understand why you're going across the border, and then, what you need to learn to cross that border successfully. Another one was Todd Fortner. He is the president of the 2nd largest company in China that makes automotive interior parts. So if you bought an Audi, let's say recently, 9 times out of 10, that all the pieces of the interior of that car were made by his company. He's an American who studied in Taiwan, and then he studied Chinese, and he's been in China now for, gosh, probably 15 years. And I always he's a friend of mine, and it's I say, what is one mistake you witness business leaders making more frequently than others? And he can say this from his own experience, but also in his family. His uncle founded Manpower Temporary Services, so which is now, of course, around the world. So he also saw, grew up seeing things that went well and things that went wrong. And so when we say, what mistake do you see people making most frequently, is basically, he says, they don't listen. And because they think they know it all. And I think we have seen that with, our colleagues or other clients or vendors or whatever in our own country. And what I really liked what he said was sometimes we just need to listen more, be humble, and recognize that we don't know everything when we come to a new place. And that always goes to another quote of mine that I heard somewhere that says, I may not know everything, but I know what I'm doing. And that kind of goes back to the principle of communication, because to me, when we say communication, it usually means us talking, talk, not listening, particularly not actively listening. Okay, I'm sure we all know Jim Kouzes. Him and Barry Posner, of course, with their the Work Leadership Challenge that I know I've used that for years, the book. What is the biggest challenge facing global business leaders? And his kind of goes back to Handy, saying virtual trust is very difficult to establish. And I can tell you, no matter what people say, and disagree with that, in my research and experience, it's very true. In being in a cubicle in Silicon Valley, how do I establish trust with my marketing colleague in Poland who has a Polish server for our company in his garage? I mean, you might meet them once a year at a conference, but it's very important because people think now in this era of, Facebook, with it LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, I'm sure I'm missing some. Yes, it's been, we're able to communicate more and faster, but I call them, we're having just such a deluge of throwaway conversations. So you're on your smartphone and you're waiting for, I don't know, for a store to open, let's say. And, you're playing on your phone and, using acronyms, LOL, TTYL. Even with my students now, my younger ones, they've known nothing that has not been made easier because of technology, because of when they were born. And I mean, I used the internet years ago because I had a temporary job at Caltech, and that was when only that's only when scientists had email. And so what's happening now is you're having all these modes of communication, and everyone runs out to buy the Apple iPhone 6, okay, or 6 Super, 6S, I'm sorry, I don't really know which one it is, but does that inherently make your conversations better? I mean, I'm guilty of it. My husband could be in another room, and I'll text him a question because I'm just lazy sometimes, and, it's making us more lazy in a way, but in terms of doing business, virtual trust still is very difficult to establish, and especially if you're going to open up or start a partnership with millions of dollars, let's say, in Germany. Well, then go to Germany, spend 3 months there, learn the language, learn the culture. I think if Walmart had done that, they would not have failed so immensely as they did in Germany. Okay. Another one is Marshall Goldsmith. He is a top executive coach in the country. And I'm just going to say through this, how important is it for leaders to develop his or her own self-awareness? And that was so funny because we didn't really talk to him about self-awareness in depth, but his answer and throughout the full survey was self-awareness. It was self-awareness is a mark of an incredibly great leader. So, you know, it's kind of the idea, if I don't know myself, how can I know you? If I can't teach myself, how can I teach you? Which is then goes into the idea of you need to be flexible and adaptable, or, you know, in order to keep up with the dynamic workplace. But very important, you know, I see particularly in my research in the United States, ethnocentrism, thinking our culture is better than someone else's, is not helping us, because, again, no culture is bad or good. It's just, you know, bad or good decisions made within the culture. And self-awareness, if I take away anything from this whole webinar, it would be that, is self-awareness, because we need to be self-aware of our own background and our own bias that we may not even have ever thought about asking ourselves. Okay, this one interview was very interesting. This is a former student of mine who works for Interpol. He is the Interpol representative to the European Union. So how have global leaders you worked with encouraged creative thinking within their organizations? His survey answers, I think we had 10 pages. So as you can imagine, he's in the, you know, the policing arena, and all the countries that are now in the EU, obviously they all have their own languages, their own cultures, their own subcultures, their own dialects. I mean, it's very, very complex. So as a head sort of police person, how do you, in the EU, how do you make, you know, laws that say, you know, this is wrong and this is right? It's sort of like Madeleine Albright would say, well, you know, that's not cultural, that's criminal. Okay, is that true in every single country? It depends who you ask. And so, you know, when he has to find, you know, I think the two top issues right now they're working on is obviously human trafficking and the import and exporting of drugs, particularly in Europe. And so, you know, he's saying we have to learn that for, you know, the 20 to 30 countries that we have in the EU. How do you do that when everybody's different? And everybody, you know, you could even say there's a culture of crime. So it's a very tough job, but, you know, he's saying to achieve the goals that they want to with less resources, you have to be creative. And it's the best source to achieve corporate and personal satisfaction. Because if you're saying, you know, the, let's say the drug problem just in the EU countries, not even counting the ones that are not in the monetary union, and say, okay, it's a $5 billion a year problem, okay? And, you know, he's not giving that kind of budget. So you have to get creative in how, you know, you're going to be a leader. And I often think to myself, creativity should have been one of the 7 C's, because I think within all our jobs, we have to, situational leadership is very important, but we have to be creative in order to get done what we need to get done. Another one we have was George Mitchell. I'm sure you all know him from his days in Washington. He's now the head of DLA Piper, a very large law firm around the world, and he was a former U.S. envoy. He was one working for a very long time brokering peace in Northern Ireland. And he also sits on the board of many Fortune 500 companies. So we asked him, what effect do you think national culture has on business leadership with these, you know, Fortune 500 global organizations? And, you know, how does even your own native national culture affect decision making? And basically what he said was, not all people react the same way to events, but all people are influenced by these factors. And I just thought that was a very powerful statement, because just as being a teacher, as many of us might be, you have an assignment, and you will give that to 10 people. It's all worded the same, and when you get the assignment back, you get 10 entirely different interpretations of what the assignment was. And so as you can imagine, dealing with that on a national level, on a global level, it's very important to understand that. So we may react differently, but we're still going to be influenced by it, no matter how anything happens. So that, I think, was a key piece in his interview. This one I'll just touch on very briefly. Somebody I had met from the United Nations called Jean-Christophe Bass. There is a part of the United Nations called, I think, the Strategic Association for Ancient Civilizations, something like that. And he was the head of it. He actually now has left that, and I think he's working in Geneva, I want to say for the World Economic Forum. So, working in the UN for many years, he has many very incredible insights. And we asked him, how does national culture affect the rate of acceptance of globalization in certain parts of the world? And he says, the main point is there are growing gaps between the winners and the losers of globalization. I think you hear that all the time on the news, even in this country, the top 1% or whatever. And that's just not happening here. It's happening around the world. I think there are very few countries and cultures that are not affected somehow by globalization. So that's something really important to realize. Because globalization, when I look at it positively, to me it says everybody in the world can have the same experience despite where they are, who they are, and what they're doing. Whereas globalization is very negative to some people, where they're saying, indigenous cultures, for example, are being driven out in the face of mega corporations, let's say, Coca-Cola or something like that. I had a colleague who worked for Guinness Beer. As you could tell, my family was from Ireland. And his job in Africa, he lived in Gabon, Tanzania, I can't remember where else. He was a marketing manager. His job was basically to travel around to every bar in Africa and get them to sell Guinness Beer. And he was telling me, just, well, in this country this worked, and in this country this didn't work. And it's very interesting because a few weeks ago I had the pleasure of hosting a delegation of 2 gentlemen and an interpreter from Chad, which is in the heart of Africa. I knew nothing about Chad. And so I read up on it, and we went out, we talked, and it was so fascinating. And they have 7 neighbors. They're really right in the center of Africa. And you can imagine when you have 7 nations all around you, and they're all having problems. I mean, how do you, keep yourself safe and things of that nature? So that, and how each of those is dealing with globalization, and how each of those neighbors, how they're dealing with the gaps. You can just say that country, Chad isn't affected by globalization. But if their neighbors are, they are influenced, then Chad also will be influenced. This is very interesting for the idea of change. Jerry Ridge, he's the CEO of WD-40, which I'm sure every one of us has in our garage. And it wasn't something that I had even thought about. But a very interesting man. It's basically one product, one company, one product. What is one mistake you witness business leaders make more frequently than others? And he basically says, bumps in the road are to be expected, but short-termism often wins out as people focus on the short term. This is not the way to build enduring businesses. And we should be making decisions to build enduring businesses and company organizations over time. And obviously the U.S., if you go by a Hofstede standard, is very short term. We need to make our numbers. I work for a company where the CEO had a very Machiavellian type of mindset. Do whatever it takes to make your numbers quarterly. And I just remember being in the hospital because I'd been so stressed and having people call me in the hospital for, information. And I thought, this really is not right. So I'm always a big fan of the long-term orientation, whether it's in business or in learning, teaching, whatever. And I think sometimes we see that how short-term thinking and orientation is not to our benefit. This is capability, and I have to say this is a very interesting interview. The person I interview, I've actually met her several times in San Diego here. She is Uzbayar Vangansuren. I hope I said that right. And she is a professor at the National Academy of Governance in Mongolia, in the capital Ulaanbaatar. It's a university owned by the government. And I mean, we hear about Mongolia, we think Genghis Khan, but we don't really know. I think the vast majority of people don't really know a lot about it. But, if you're Rio Tinto, if you're a mining company, you know about Mongolia. Again, fastest growing economy in the world, resource rich. So what's happening is kind of like the gold rush again. People are just going there, setting up camp and, signing agreements with the government, which has been very highly rated on the corruption scale, according to Transparency International. That's transparency.org, a website I highly recommend. And what has come out of that is some cultural aspects that have an effect on decision making, and she's talking about Mongolia, is nepotism, corruption, and cultural biases, which are this, prejudices, things like that, and they're pertinent to the culture. And so, you say, okay, I want to go do business in Mongolia. Well, for example, before they start a project, they will have a Buddhist monk come and have a ceremony and basically give their, I want to say, blessing to the project because it's very important to them in their culture. And when you have people coming from other cultures who don't understand that, who don't appreciate that, who want to bypass that, then there are problems. And there actually have been problems most recently because of this, because people are saying, even though you have these resources in Mongolia, we're the ones that have the money and the equipment to get, to extract it so that we can give it back to the people of Mongolia, and they can, have a better standard of living. Not to say that their standard of living, who are we to judge that? It's very similar to, years ago when Indian casinos were opening up on Indian reservations, and they said this will be good for the Native Americans because they will get money from their land. It's very similar here as in Mongolia. So I just thought, I'm always trying to find out information about countries you hear about but you know nothing about. And so it's important if you were saying, okay, we're going to open an office in Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, okay, how do we do this? Where do we start? And, just doing your basic cultural due diligence is so very important. And then the next thing is go there and immerse yourself in it. Because I remember, I believe it was during either, just the father, George Bush, he had an ambassador to Mongolia, and that ambassador would not live in Mongolia because of the living standard there. And that to me was just so amazing. Now, I don't know if the current U.S. ambassador to Mongolia is living in Ulaanbaatar, but, that to me was very, in a way, disrespectful. So obviously it depends on kind of what, lens you use, what cultural glasses you're wearing today. So all in all, we come back to the bottom line, as we do in the U.S., our favorite metric, our ROI. And humans are quite similar as beings in some ways. However, cultures, we vary widely in our worldview. Everything we do is influenced in some way by cultural norms. And this includes how we both conduct and lead businesses globally. So that's kind of where, I want to sort of start to wrap things up. We didn't touch on, we have actually 3 other chapters in the book that are new. One is gender and leadership, and that was so fascinating to talk to the different women we interviewed about their experiences and how they see the next, several decades and women around the world progressing or not progressing forward. Then the other one was technology and leadership. We talked to a couple of CEOs. One I remember was the CEO of a company in Carlsbad here in San Diego called Viasat. They are now, I believe, the #1 satellite company in the world, and their facility is just amazing. And their CEO truly believes in education, and that's why, for example, particularly for young girls, I belong to another organization where we have a summer camp for girls to learn about careers in science, technology, engineering, and math, and we take them for a day to the Viasat campus. And they're seeing how satellites are built, how they operate, and it's amazing. So that's something that's very important. And then, of course, the last chapter is geoleadership and the community. How can you apply it to the community? Is it something that can be applied to every community or not? And what I want to do, sorry, let me go back a little bit, is on this slide here, I wanted to just kind of go back to Maureen because she was such a wonderful research associate on these chapters on gender and technology, along with Edgar Schein. So I can't imagine, it's an amazing opportunity, when I was getting my doctorate 10 years ago, for example, to be able to work with someone of his stature, well, obviously he'd been retired from MIT, he lives up in Palo Alto, but both of them equally contributed to these 2 new chapters. And I was honored to have both of them be part of this project. And without their contribution, I'm not sure though the quality, let's say, of those 2 chapters would be as valuable as they are now. So I think that's it for about now. I'm not sure if we're going to have time to look at the video, but I'm going to turn it back to Maureen so that we can look at, if you have questions and answers, I am happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, EILEEN, and thank you so much for taking your time and sharing your work and expertise with us. We're going to go ahead and have participants email their questions to membership@ILA-net.org. That's membership@ILA-net.org. We want to make sure that our lunch hours and our afternoons are intact after this hour. So we'll go ahead and forward those questions directly to EILEEN, and we'll go ahead and also capture the ones that have come in and share them with EILEEN for answers. Again, thank you so much to Dr. Wibbeke for sharing her work and expertise. We hope that you enjoyed today's webinar, and I also hope that you'll be able to join us for the next installment of the Leadership Perspectives webinar series, Advancing Relational Leadership Research, and that's with Mary Yulbian and Sonia Ospeya, which is a really exciting opportunity that will be held at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, November 12th, 2014. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great day.
Thank you.